Welcome to the Experts in Sport podcast, brought to you by the School of Sport, Exercise and Health Sciences at Loughborough University.
I'm Stuart McErlain-Naylor, and in this sports performance episode, I'm joined by Dr. Laurence Wareen-Westgate, who is an assistant professor in sport, exercise and health psychology at the University of Nottingham. Laurence did his PhD at Loughborough University, studying deception in rugby from a psychological, biomechanical and motor control perspective. We'll discuss some of that work, the findings, and how it can be applied to benefit athletes. Hi Laurence, welcome to the Experts in Sport podcast.
Thanks for having me, it's good to be here.
No worries, looking forward to it. So to start with then, why deception in rugby? Why, I guess, tell me a bit about your background and kind of how you came to be studying deception in rugby.
Like many of us, I was a sport and exercise science undergraduate that didn't really know where I wanted to go with it. But during that, realised I had a real passion for sports psychology. Something kind of clicked there. Went on to do a master's in sport and exercise psychology as well, with various projects throughout my undergrad and my master's, looking at things like differential learning, special skill, so very much the kind of skill acquisition or perceptual cognitive expertise side of things. Throughout this, I was also playing rugby. Wasn't the best rugby player in the world, but also wasn't terrible. In various like academy setups throughout my youth rugby, and then playing some National League rugby, adult level. So this kind of drew in that interest in when the PhD opportunity came about, thinking, well, how can I use my knowledge of this specific sporting environment to also enhance this knowledge base based on this PhD topic around this advanced information use. So played during my PhD study as well. So I was playing for, like I said, National League clubs, and then played up until about 2 years ago now when I finally retired. Probably overdue, but yeah, so that interest in rugby is still there, but now more on the academic side.
And one of the things I really like, I think, about your work is it sits at the intersection of a few different disciplines. So I think, you mentioned the interest and specialism in psychology, but there's also bits of biomechanics, bits of motor control. So I guess, how did that come about? Are you a psychologist that had to learn some biomechanics for the sake of the PhD, or a biomechanist that learned a bit of psychology? Kind of, how did that come about, really?
Well, I guess this is where that broad undergraduate degree has kind of helped me. So I was a bit of a multi-tool during my undergrad. I was all right across the board, but like I said, I just something clicked with psychology, but I didn't really have any disciplines that I disliked. So then when this PhD opportunity came about, with Robin Jackson, so from sports psychology, and Mike Hiley from the kind of motor control biomechanics side of things, it was a really good chance to kind of strum up this interdisciplinary team where we had these sort of behavioral and verbal responses and the psychological way of looking at things, as well as this idea around, well, how can we also make sure we're measuring the movement, considering the way people actually physically respond in their environments by combining these different measures and these different skills. And I've stayed within that kind of middle ground since, I guess.
I think it's a good place to be honest. I think, there's definitely a lot of good research. Well, maybe not a lot, maybe that's a problem, but there's some good research, I think, that is at that intersection of different sports science disciplines. And it is where, sometimes we look at biomechanics and ignore the effect that has on the physiology, or ignore whether people can actually learn that skill in the first place, or how to coach it. Or people look at psychology and, forget the actual movement that's taking place during it, etc. So I think, it's definitely a good place to be. It's something maybe more people should do. But just to get a bit more specific then, a lot of the work has looked at things like anticipation. Like, for the listeners, what does anticipation in sport mean? And I guess, why is it important to look at that?
Anticipation fits within the broader scope of perceptual cognitive expertise. And this is where a player or performer kind of integrates the information available to them at any given time and uses this to select a suitable response based on what's going on around them. And within this, anticipation then describes that ability to recognize or predict the outcome of an event based on action prior to or during that action. So basically, anticipation is that ability to predict what will happen next. And this is really important in sports where effectively you don't have enough time to respond to something once it's already happened. An example I will always tend to give in introductory lectures about this, because I think it's one that most people have seen or can relate to slightly, is that the penalty scenario in football. So if we look at it through a really simple kind of information processing kind of model, where there's a reaction time in there of around 200 milliseconds, and it takes the goalkeeper 500 milliseconds to dive to the corner of the goal. So that's 700 milliseconds. If we then factor in that a typical penalty kick that is hit with reasonable force, it will take around 500 milliseconds to reach the corner of the goal from the moment it's kicked. You realise that if a goalkeeper responds after it's kicked, they're going to be there 200 milliseconds after the ball has crossed the line. So it's that idea that in many of these sporting environments where things move quickly, you have to be able to anticipate what will happen next to win.
And what kind of scenarios might we be talking about in rugby then? Because I think the penalty example is really clear. In rugby, what kind of scenarios were you looking at?
So my work in rugby then has typically looked at the change of direction in the tackle scenario. So be that from someone simply running and making a sharp change of direction, or someone running and performing a evasive or deceptive sidestep, so going one way and then back the other way, and looking at how individuals kind of interpret and respond to that. Similar to the football example, if someone's changing a direction and you change too late, or you try and respond after they've changed direction, you might not be able to get there in time to actually make the tackle. So you may have to look to try and intercept that movement earlier on.
And then I assume where it gets even more interesting potentially is trying to figure out how people are able to do this. You know, in the penalty example, which I agree with you, works for me because I can imagine it, having never been a rugby player. I guess it's, you know, what is the goalkeeper actually looking at that enables them to figure out which way the person's going to place the ball. And then, yeah, I guess even the alternative way, you've got the player running up to take the penalty. What can they do to try and trick the goalkeeper into going the wrong way? Is that the kind of area that your work's getting into with the rugby example, looking at, you know, what are people doing to try and predict which way the player's going to go? How do you deceive, etc.?
Yeah, so we've looked quite extensively now at what players are looking at to try and determine what way they think the opponent is going to go. So the player with the ball, what way they think they're going to go. Not done anything yet looking at what they can do to perhaps influence what way that player will go yet. So it's more kind of been one way so far. On the football side of things, you start getting into your keeper dependent and keeper independent sort of interactions in that duel, but that's a different thing going on there.
And then I guess before we get into the specifics of your kind of more recent work, how have these things typically been studied? You know, I assume you're not the first person to look at the idea of anticipation or deception in sport. Is there a way that this was generally done back in the old days?
Yeah, I'm not going to claim to be the first person ever to delve into this area. It definitely predates me. Deception, I think, probably goes back about 20 years now, but yeah, anticipation more before that. But there are a few traditional methods that have stuck, and these have typically been used to determine kind of when key information is presented and also what key information is presented. So the when example is the temporal occlusion paradigm. The temporal occlusion paradigm then is that kind of systematic stopping or masking at different time points. So temporal just meaning kind of time, occlusion meaning block or hidden. And it typically involves a video being presented to a participant that stops at these given time points relative to a key event. So in something like badminton, it might be all these time points relative to when the racket hits the shuttlecock. In rugby, it might be relative to that footfall used to push off for that final change of direction. By presenting these clips to participants at these different time points, you then begin to see at what point do they know what's going to happen. And this this allows the researchers to then think, right, this is when the key information for this event is available. So that gives us the when, and then the what has typically been studied using what's called a spatial occlusion paradigm. So again, occlusion still meaning kind of blocked, or actually in this instance, or presented in isolation. And spatial just mean areas of the display. So this you will occlude different areas of the visual field and then systematically manipulate how much information you're giving to that participant. So this might be you'll display a video to a participant and you will remove the head from the performer, or you might remove the legs, and then you'll see how well they're able to determine what the outcome of the action is without that information being presented. Or in isolation, you might look at how well they can predict the outcome of an action when they can only see the legs, for instance. So then you get the relative contribution of these different body parts to predicting the outcome of that action.
Okay, so I imagine then the assumption there is that sort of if you remove the legs and their performance or their ability to predict remains the same, you're assuming that either they were never looking at the legs in the first place, or the legs aren't actually useful for them. And kind of, is that the kind of idea? You're removing bits of information and just saying, does their performance get better, worse, or stay the same with or without this information available?
Excellent. Yeah, that's exactly it. So it's all sort of relative to that control with the spatial occlusion. So the control being when it's presented without any occlusion, looking at how it differs when you put these things in isolation or remove a certain cue. And then unsurprisingly, you can see kind of if we have the what and the when, often these are also used together to give that kind of more holistic picture of what's going on.
Okay, so it sounds like a much more complicated and much more kind of rigorous scientific version of I don't know if you've seen the Cristiano Ronaldo documentary, where there's you know, I can't remember who it is, but yeah, basically putting in a cross, the lights go off at different points, and it's like, if the lights go off while the ball's in the air, can he still predict where it was going to be and score a goal? If the lights go off just as the ball was about to be kicked, can he still score? It's kind of that idea, but I guess you're kind of perturbing it in a much more scientific way than just switching off the lights randomly as the ball's in the air.
I think that the final one, I know the example you're about where the lights go off just before the ball's kicked, I think is a really nice example of a temporal occlusion and some advanced cue utilization as well.
Yeah, I know with this not being my area, but some things in cricket batting biomechanics that we've looked at. I know there are previous studies that have done similar things, and I know they've, looked at the similar example of what if you stop the video just as the ball bounces, can the batter still predict where it's going to go or still connect with where the ball would be? Or if you stop the video just as the ball's going to be released out of the bowler's hand, can they still predict it? And I think, yeah, it's that kind of things. I think I'm sure there are some limitations, but yeah, it seems like quite an intuitive approach to me. A bit like you said with the penalty example. Hopefully people can picture this idea of lights go off. If you're still successful, you obviously weren't using or weren't needing that information that's now disappeared. So I guess based on that then, how do we know, or are there any ways of doing this in more realistic scenarios? So rather than, say, removing the legs and saying, therefore, they must not have been looking at the legs, are there any ways of actually figuring out what people are looking at?
Yeah, definitely. I think this is where we get into more what I do. So around that that method of gaze analysis. So using either eye tracking glasses or remote eye trackers. So these typically are like effectively it looks like almost like a sound bar that you'd put on the base of a computer screen or monitor, or you can even put them on a tripod if you're using a slightly larger external display. And these are used to map where someone is looking relative to that display. So obviously you have to calibrate them, but generally it will map their eyes in relation to that display or the world camera that the glasses have on them, and tell you where they're looking at any given point in time during that task.
I guess if you say that's getting closer to the kind of work that you do, could you just describe them? What do your studies look like? If I'm a rugby player, I assume you've got rugby players kind of coming into the lab. If I'm a rugby player coming in, you're going to do some kind of experiment, I imagine. What would it look like? What would the setup be? What kind of tasks would you be asking me to do?
I've had a few experimental designs, some that have just used, say just like it plays it down, but some that have used a remote eye tracker on a laptop, and they've been your typical button press temporal occlusion designs with that visual data. And I've also used ones where we try and maybe replicate a slightly more realistic response scenario. I'll describe this one because I think it's a bit more exciting. So in this example, then a participant would visit the lab, and I'd fit them up with a few optoelectronic markers for a motion capture system to monitor their physical responses, i.e. maybe some markers around the hips to give me that crude indication of that center of mass displacement. Again, it's not a full center of mass measure, but in this instance is near enough to get that kind of that main hip movement that would show us that first change of direction. Couple that with some force plates, so we're getting the kind of medial lateral forces for that change, initiating that change direction, and then present life-size video trials of someone running towards them, changing direction with or without a deceptive sidestep, whilst the participants wearing eye tracking goggles to monitor where they're looking on that display. And then we've got their physical responses based on their movement, and also tend to couple that with verbal responses based on what they think at the end of that trial. So it's always quite interesting when you have a participant that has jumped to the left to try and intercept this virtual player, or this player on the screen, and then tells you, yeah, I thought they were going to the right, because they've bitten on that fake, they've fallen for it, but then they've realized, oh no, it's actually going the other way.
Interesting. And yeah, I really like actually the fact that you've got them jumping to the left in that example. You know, it's not just staring at a laptop and saying, I think they're going to go to the left. You've actually got them. I guess that maybe makes it a bit more realistic, but also puts a bit more time pressure on, in that they can't necessarily, as you say, wait till the last minute and get it correct. They've actually got to make that decision at the time at which they would need to move. And yeah, it's interesting. We'll maybe get onto this a bit later, but it's interesting that bit around maybe changing their mind and making one decision and then realizing that they've made the wrong decision. And even, I guess you can then look at, you've almost got two separate bits there of what were they looking at when they got it wrong, and then what were they looking at when they then realized and got it right. But yeah, maybe that's a separate bit we can chat about later on. So I guess on that first bit then, just the initial kind of decision making, we jump to some results. What kind of things are players looking at when they're making, whether it's a right decision or a wrong decision, if they're deciding which way to go, which way to jump off of that force plate, what are they looking at to help them make those decisions?
To make those decisions, then, we typically find that there are some differences in high skilled or recreational or novices in terms of where they look to try and predict what way they think these opposition player is going to go. Typically, your high skilled players in the rugby example tend to look more around the kind of hips or abdomen area, that kind of lower trunk, whereas low skilled players would still look towards that area as the action went on, but would spend more time overall in comparison to the high skilled players looking at the head, whereas high skilled players didn't really tend to look towards the head much in this scenario. Despite that, though, all players would, as the action unfolded, have that shift towards the middle of the body.
Interesting. So yeah, and my mind's already jumping around and I'm thinking, right, which question do I actually want to ask of about the three that are in my head? But yeah, on that, I guess it then gets even more interesting, and this might be harder to answer and you might not actually have the answers yet, but I'm just trying to think, you know, why. It then gets interesting saying, why are the successful players looking at the hips? And like I say, is it that looking at the hips is good, or is it that looking at the head is bad? In that they're kind of, looking at the head, that's typically where players will try and look the wrong way to throw them off. So it's almost like they've learned to look at the hips so that they don't get thrown the wrong way by eyes and things like that. Or is it that the hips give correct cues, or is it that, I guess, in a lot of sporting movements, and I know nothing about rugby, we kind of start with central movements and then it kind of moves further outwards in the body. So I'm thinking, is it that the hips are the first thing that moves, and therefore you can judge it earlier by looking at the hips rather than looking at anything else? So yeah, I don't even know if this is a question or just me going on a bit of a waffly rant, not necessarily a rant, but a bit of a monologue. But yeah, I'm just trying to think, why is it that they're looking at the hips compared to anything else? And is it just that, that you can't fake what the hips are doing? I don't know what my question is there, but if you've got any comments on any of that, then go for it.
I think anyway, I think I know what you're getting at there, and it is it's a difficult question or musing. From what we found in terms of our responses to these video trials, in both the larger lab where they're moving in response to these clips, but also on the computer-based version where they're pressing the buttons, you would infer that this information source in isolation might be where some of the key information is for predicting the outcome of the action. So maybe this middle part of the body, as you mentioned, maybe because that might be one of the earlier things to go, or it might indicate that kind of end direction of travel based on that full body movement. Typically as well, you might think, well, if it's something like a change of direction in rugby, maybe a tip of the head or looking the other way slightly might be used to try and deceive someone. Again, maybe that was why these lower skilled or recreational participants maybe I guess bought that fake more often than the high skilled participants. But then we actually followed this with a study that is, well, it's been submitted for review at the minute. It's one where I guess the interdisciplinary side of my work kind of came in, where we did actually get rugby players in the lab, in a biomechanics lab, and compare these deceptive actions with their genuine counterparts. So changing with a side step, or just running and performing just a sharp cut change direction. And then within that, we found some contrasting bits around things like the hips. So, for instance, the hips weren't really doing anything different between the two actions until quite late on in the action. So perhaps they might not be this great source of information that I guess rugby coaches and the eye tracking data would potentially say they are. That whereas the head was kind of tilted towards that fake direction of travel, so maybe that is a deceptive cue, as other researchers have suggested. But in terms of the ones used for determining what's going on, it's less clear. I guess it also brings in the idea that maybe some researchers have suggested that this central point on the body might actually be used as something like a gaze anchor or a gaze pivot. So fixating on a fairly still part of the body or fairly central part, and then using that to monitor what's going on around it.
Interesting. So that links into something I thought about earlier and then decided I think we moved on. I wasn't going to ask, but I've got a background as an official in sports, in netball, but I was thinking about eye tracking in that context, just that, it'd be really useful for me or for us as officials to know, where were we actually looking when we made that decision, etc. But then I was thinking of the limitation of almost that contrast between really focused vision. Like if I'm looking at you now on my screen, I'm kind of definitely looking at you and not whatever else is behind or in the room I'm in. Whereas when umpiring, you're often using peripheral vision a lot more. You might be kind of, I don't know exactly how the eye tracking works, but I was thinking that it might say that I'm looking in the middle of a bunch of players because that's kind of the midpoint of my visual field. but I'm actually taking in information from the edges where I've got players on both sides of that central point I'm looking at. So I know it just, when you said that, that kind of resonates with me, that the players, I guess, might be looking at the hip, but also taking in information elsewhere. So it might be a bit of a central point that they're looking at. If that's what you mean by an anchor point, then I think I've understood. If it's not, then I'm completely going off down the wrong path. But it's interesting anyway.
No, I think this is definitely potentially one of the limitations with things that utilize measures of visual gaze, is that we have this assumption that this foveal vision, so this central vision, this point where someone is looking, is the information they're attending to. Whereas it is also possible to process this peripheral vision, like you said in that example you just spoke about there. It might not necessarily be that exact point where those eyes are fixated that moment in time. They could be monitoring these various different things going on at once.
Okay, so then you kind of touched on this earlier anyway, but if we know from your study that players are typically looking at, or higher level players are typically looking at the hips, does that mean the hips are potentially a good source of deceptive information? If you want to deceive someone, can you use it the other way around and say, I know players are looking at the hips, therefore I should try and fake my hip movements? Or do you think, is it more a case of you can't fake what your hips are doing, because if you moved your hips in the wrong way, you'd go the way your hips have moved? So kind of, I guess what I'm getting at is, can you use that information to help you deceive people? Or is it a case of you can't fake what your hips are doing, and that's why it might be a good thing to look at?
Well, there's definite examples in all sports that high skill performers are able to hone these ways that they're able to deceive people, or else we'd all be equally good at deceptive actions. Whether or not they can exaggerate these actions to gain this competitive advantage, I think definitely warrants further investigation. Does it then begin to compromise the postural stability? So if I'm trying to move my hips now way outside where they'd typically be in terms of that relative space, will it cause me to fall over whilst changing direction? Like, have I gone beyond that point of return in that respect?
And when you've got someone trying to tackle you at the same time, then I guess that's a really good point.
Yeah, you don't want to compromise that movement or potentially the safety of being able to be in a strong position to take that tackle. But it's not out there yet, but we do have evidence that being able to potentially exaggerate some of these kinematics in the movement can impair someone's ability to correctly discriminate between deceptive and genuine actions.
Okay, so then is this, I guess, as well, like I said about, I love the fact you've got actual movement responses, and it's not just in all studies pressing a button or speaking out loud. I'm trying to think of the bigger, I guess, match context. And again, I know nothing about rugby, but I'm thinking about things like boxing, where people might try and set up a certain response earlier in the match, so they know every time they throw a certain type of shot, and they're kind of almost setting it like, every time I do this particular thing follows it. And then once the opponent starts to fall into that trap, they'll test it a few times. Okay, I know whenever I do this is how they're responding. Now I can try and throw that, but not follow it up with that one, follow it up with something else. And kind of, I know this is really hard to actually study in a lab setting, but is it this kind of context specific thing where maybe you can do something early in a match to try and set that trap for people to fall into later? Or do you think it is more of a kind of every isolated thing on its own?
No, I think what you've alluded to there, maybe accidentally, is the work on situational probability.
It was definitely accidental, because I've got no idea what situational probability is. So if you could explain that for me, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. So situational probability, typically you effectively give a participant the outcome, so probability outcomes, before you then display something to them. So you might say it's 50-50 chance that they'll go left or right, or it might be a 67-33 chance, so 2/3, 1/3 chance they'll go left or right, or then even more extreme, And then you use this almost to prime their perceptual bias. And so if like the boxing example you give, if they kept throwing the same combination, you would think, okay, every time this happens, this one comes afterwards. So there's that situational probability there. You in your head, you've increased the likelihood of that other action happening. And what this has been shown to do then is to strengthen the bias towards actions. So you then might be more likely to think something is a deceptive action or a genuine action based on the fact that it's happened before. That's the usual pattern. And I think where in the boxing example, that's fairly straightforward, and some of these high risk examples, but other places where that can come in is you see a lot now with, again, the penalty kick scenario in football. I think there's been a few famous examples of when the typical shot placement is written on the goalkeeper's bottle, for instance, or they've got the little sheet saying this player usually places it here. And the idea around that is, well, they're probably going to do the same thing. But this situational probability work that effectively suggests that if a fake action is in the same direction as what that sheet might say is going to happen, then you're more likely to fall for that fake.
Okay, yeah, I get you. So you're basically saying so again, in that penalty example, if I've been told kind of 2/3 of your penalties go in the bottom left corner, if you then fake towards the bottom left corner before going somewhere else, I'm more likely to fall for that, because it's almost saying I've got all these different sources of information. It's not just the way you're running up, it's kind of the way you're running up and what I was told in advance. It all matches up, so then I'm more confident than I would be if I was just watching your run up. So it's kind of, I get what you're saying. Yeah, it's almost,
yep.
If they were genuinely doing that thing that you think is the most likely, it's probably going to help them having that information in advance, because it'll make them more confident. But if they're not actually going to do it, if they're faking towards the thing that you've been told they're likely to do, then that pre-information is more likely to result in you being deceived.
Yeah, you've effectively primed yourself for information that confirms that bias.
Yeah, that makes sense. So then, well, most of this then has been around deceiving people or faking. Is that, I'm thinking of other sports where you might just try and hide information. So instead of, I'm picturing, a cricket bowler running up and maybe trying to hide the seam of the ball in their hand, or trying to make sure that two different variations look the same until the last possible moment. Is this just a maybe simpler version of all of the faking and deceiving research, or is it kind of a completely separate area of work?
I would say they are two separate things. I think to do this, we need to distinguish between disguise and deception. As we've talked about deception so far. So deceptive actions are performed to deliberately mislead someone into triggering an incorrect response. So you're getting them way below chance level. So i.e. way below the point where if I told you to guess, you'd typically be 50-50. I'm trying to take you below that mark. Or if it's with more outcomes, then obviously that percentage changes in terms of what it would be like with no information at all. Trying to get you below that point where if you were just at chance level. Whereas disguise is performed to keep an opponent in suspense and maintain that ambiguity of the action. So looking to kind of conceal your true intention and keep them at chance level. So in many experimental paradigms, that might be keeping people around the 50-50 mark if it's a guess left or right. But in something like cricket, where there's so many different deliveries you could choose, you might not necessarily need to deceive someone. Just look to make sure that they can't pick up on what you're actually going to do.
Okay, that's an interesting point. So it might relate to the number of possibilities, in that, if you've got lots and lots of possibilities to choose from, simply just delaying the point at which they get any useful information is probably enough. Whereas, maybe if there's only two choices, it might be more useful to try and deceive. I don't know. I guess it maybe links back to that thing you said at the start about penalties and the time available, in that, if you can delay it until they've not got enough time left to move, then job done. Whereas if they've still got time to respond, maybe the deceiving them bit would be more useful, because otherwise they can still make the correct decision, I think. Just thinking out loud. But you've mentioned a few times the idea of higher level players and recreational players. I assume higher level players are better at all of this, kind of both better at deceiving people, but also better at avoiding being deceived, or better at kind of making the correct decision. Is it that simple, or is it kind of more complicated than that? Or are there any examples you can think of around, giving a bit more information in terms of what is it that higher level players do differently to lower level players in this space?
Yeah, sure. So I guess this takes us all the way back to the beginning of my PhD, where we essentially reconceptualized how deception in this area was examined. So previously, it was always looked at quite late on in the action. Some studies determining that high skill players weren't ever deceived; they were completely immune to it. Others finding that they were deceived, but only slightly, and then improved rapidly. But what all this work was missing was the actual point of when they were deceived. So if you look at these studies sort of predating 2018, when deception was examined, it was always from a point of low response accuracy up to near on 100%. And we figured, well, if as we've already talked about, this chance level, if it's a 50-50 left-right task, if they're already below 50, something's happened. So what we did was we extended it way back to try and go back to the point where it started at 50-50, had this dip in accuracy, and then that sharp increase in accuracy that other studies had already seen.
So if I can jump in there in a minute, is that the kind of occlusion stuff you were talking about at the start again? So when you say like starting where it's 50-50 and then varying it, do you mean kind of if you only give them the first kind of tiny bit of information before anything happens, it's 50-50, and then giving kind of more and more of the video or more and more visual information each time and looking at whether that 50-50 goes up or down? Is that the kind of change that you're talking about?
Excellent. Yeah, exactly that. So going back 500-600 milliseconds, whatever, before that first change in direction. So to that point where it's effectively the start of someone running towards you, and you've got to say if they're going left or right. It's cutting off there. You hopefully be at the point where you're guessing effectively, are they going left or right? You guess enough times, should be around 50-50, and then looking at how that response pattern changes every 100 milliseconds by this kind of systematic manipulation of how much information you're getting. So then within that, we found that both high-skilled and low-skilled players were susceptible to deception. Both groups were deceived. The main difference, however, being that, unsurprisingly, low-skilled players were more susceptible to deception. But one of the key differences is that high-skilled players were able to resolve this state of being deceived in a much sharper and quicker way. So they were deceived, but they worked out that they'd been deceived more successfully. And this is when we tied it in with physical responses. We found that this detection of deception, as we called it, so this ability to detect that they'd been deceived, to detect, almost like detecting that something had gone wrong, they were then able to use this earlier detection to then perform better physical responses that in a game situation would allow them to hopefully make a positive tackle.
Okay, so going back to your example in the lab then of that player jumping off the force plate to the left and then verbally saying they're going to go right because they've kind of realised. I wonder if this is kind of maybe a combination of two things. Are they or both groups of players being deceived at the same time and then the better players realise it? Or are the better players kind of being deceived earlier or later? If you've kind of talked about the time at which they realise something's gone wrong, are they being deceived at the same time, or is one group being deceived earlier or later than the others?
Yeah, and this was actually something we hypothesized at the very beginning of the PhD, because effectively no one knew what that was going to look like, because it had always been in the anticipation stuff effectively determined that experts see things earlier than novice performers. So from that, you might say, okay, well, there's just going to be a temporal shift, i.e. the two response patterns for the graphs for the two groups will look the same, but the experts groups will be shifted 100 milliseconds earlier.
Is that basically on the assumption that expert players they're looking at the right things, they're better at taking in and processing that information, so therefore they're going to react faster to the same kind of wrong cues?
Yeah, so it's effectively that they will see all the same things, but they'll just see them earlier. Whereas what we found was the deceptive patterns. So the pattern for being deceived was very similar between the two groups, but the difference was that they then detected it earlier. They detected that they had been deceived earlier than these lower skilled performers. The interesting part about when we put in the physical responses, that this detection allowed them to kind of suppress that initial bite response in the wrong direction. So there were still some examples where they'd move left and go, oh, it's gone to the right. But with a lot of the high skill performers, they were sort of able to override that initial want to bite on that fake and then get a physical response in the right way as well. So from that we kind of determined that this early detection actually facilitates that skilled response difference between the two groups.
Okay, and do you know, you might not have done this, but do you know if the visual cues were the same for both parts of that? As in, you said they were looking at hips earlier. Did they look at the hips when they got fooled into going the wrong way? And then also the hips then helped them to figure out, oh no, I've got it wrong. Or do you know if they were looking at kind of two different things on the body in those two phases?
So in terms of where they were looking during that phase, the high skilled groups in that study where we looked at the physical responses were predominantly focused around the abdomen and the chest area during that phase, where they either got it wrong or got it right effectively. Whereas the low skilled performers were spending up to around 40% of their time in that key time window looking at that player's head.
And that was the same for kind of both the bit where they get it wrong and then the bit where they actually either do or don't realize that they've got it wrong. There's kind of no real difference between those two. It was just kind of a consistent pattern for most people, maybe, of where they were looking.
Yeah, precisely that. Again, perhaps alluding back to that idea around these hips don't lie. It's like, well, they do sometimes lie. They both lie and tell the truth.
Just don't tell Shakira. So then I wonder if people, I assume they do, but do people have different biases? Do you get some players that are almost, every time they're always thinking they're going to go to the left, or the people that are always thinking it's going to go to the right? And it's kind of, I don't know why that would be the case, but for some reason they seem to have a bias towards thinking a particular thing is going to happen.
Yeah, and well, I imagine that it is the case that we tend to look at obviously group means, but something that's, I guess, not quite unique about our work now because more work is introducing it. But we're not one of a few studies to use the idea around if we're looking at this area, then we should be looking at what we consider to be the true nature of the task. So how well you can discriminate between actions and what your perceptual bias is towards perceiving those actions, because effectively the measure of the task is can you determine if this is a deceptive or a genuine action, as opposed to can you tell me if they're going left or right. So what we found was high skilled players were less biased towards perceiving every action they saw as genuine, whereas low skilled players might be more inclined to think every single change of direction they saw was a real change of direction. They should then follow that one.
So it's almost like I've spotted that, and they're really simplifying it. But again, I'm thinking of my officiating journey, but kind of learning. As you go through stages of development, you see this in loads of sports with officials, where they'll be a certain stage where they suddenly start spotting things off the ball, and it's kind of, oh, it's almost so happy they've spotted it that everything needs a whistle and everything gets blown up, regardless of whether it was, the actual first infringement or a follow-up responding to something else you've missed. I'm thinking whether it's that, lower skilled players are. I'm really pleased I've actually spotted a change of direction. Great. There's not actually that thought process around, is it true? Is it false? I wondered also, I really like chatting to anyone in sports science around these kind of questions, but in this space, I wonder what's exciting you at the moment, or what's next, whether it's for you or others in the space. What kind of work do you think is coming up that will either change the game or will hopefully take this kind of research into a new space and give some new insights?
Oh, that's a hard one, isn't it? Trying to predict what everyone else might be doing. All these different labs around the world that I guess don't really tell each other what we're doing until it's published. I think for me, it might be looking at this role of exaggeration. So we've got a couple, without giving away too many spoilers, a couple papers still to come. This one that I've mentioned, looking at these kinematic differences, and then a follow up to that where, well, what happens if we start to morph these kinematics slightly, if we exaggerate them slightly, and then it's
so that's like the body movements of the players, kind of. So what do you mean by morphing the body movements?
Yeah, so effectively taking that capture from that biomechanics lab, so that motion capture, turning it into a stick man, and then exaggerating that movement, so pushing bits to further one side, to try and make it it's a linear morphing process, so maybe 10% exaggerated based on its previous version, so based on the opposite version of the action. And then looking into, well, what happens if we then look to exaggerate things with something like situational probability? So can we make things like super deceptive, for instance? And then I guess that would go down the lines of the feasibility of these actions eventually. So again, potentially some more like interdisciplinary stuff, where we're saying, well, are these actually possible to use it in real life? And does it get to the point where it's too obvious, it becomes too ridiculous that no one would ever fall for it?
Interesting. Yeah, really fascinating. I guess if people listening to this, really like the sound of that and kind of can't wait to find out more when it does become available, or even if people want to just look into some of your previous work or find out a bit more about this type of research, have you got any recommendations for where people can access some of this information or what to keep an eye out for?
Yeah, so first off, feel free to contact me at the University of Nottingham. I'm the only Laurence Wareen-Westgate in the world that exists, so I'm relatively easy to track down.
I have that argument as well. Yeah, as far as I know, there are no other Stuart McErlain-Naylors. Yeah, it's a good position to be in some ways.
Yeah, that's what I mean. If you put us into Google, you'll get the right one, so you don't need to worry about that. Like I said, I'm currently in the process of publishing a few more papers in this area. Got another study up and running as well, which is no deception, but slightly different, looking at, well, maybe how does court position and squash influence what information you can pick up on, which I think is quite an interesting one, where a lot of the examples we talked about today, typically everything happens in front of someone, whereas what happens when you can see the back of someone if they're on the front left of the court? Do you change where you can pick up information based on what's available to you at that moment in time? So I think that sounds like a fun one. But yeah, I'm also hoping to be back on the conference circuit, as I could call it, in 2024. Hopefully maybe ESAN and one or two others, and yeah, just getting out there. But in all seriousness, if someone listened that's interested in this area, get in touch. Happy to have a chat, see what opportunities there might be to either, I guess, work together or something down the line.
Awesome. Thanks, Laurence. And yeah, thanks for joining us, and thanks for sharing, well, so much of your research journey, but making me think lots. Yeah, I've got a load of notes scribbled down in front of me and probably more questions bouncing around in my head than I had at the start, which I assume is a good thing, not a bad thing. Yeah, thanks for that.
No worries. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Experts in Sport podcast. If you'd like to get in touch, then please contact me, Martin Foster, at m.foster@loughborough.ac.uk. Thanks for listening. See you next time.